Hi, everyone. Welcome to week 2 already. And what I want to do with this lecture for week 2 is I want to cover some of the ground that I have you read about in the assigned readings. As you notice, I have you read the first 3 chapters of the Kettle text, and then I have you read Goodnow and Wilson. Now, Wilson and Goodnow are among the foundational writings in public administration. So it's really important to keep in mind the influence that they had, um, in the formative years of public administration, and as scholars look back on the formative years of public administration to understand where public administration thought originated in the United States, that is, and where it's going. So those are a little bit more difficult to read just because of the writing style. But you do want to spend some time reading those. And then, of course, I have you look at the Kittle text. So I'm going to say more about the Kittle text in a bit. Okay, so here's the overriding question, and that is, what is public administration? Well, Kittle says, I think it's in chapter 3, that analysts and scholars have never agreed on a common definition, which is a little bit problematic. Um, but the reason for that is that public administration is quite broad. So even if you look at the professors in our School of Public Administration and their specialties, you would find that we have people who have researched local government, people who have researched budget and finance at the local level, people who talk about theory, people who talk about nonprofits, people who talk about emergency management. Uh, and there's probably more. So the issue is that public administration has become something of a broad academic endeavor that can get frustrating for people to think, well, there's no overriding single unifying theory of public administration, and many people do claim that. But nevertheless, it's not going to hurt us to talk about what is key in public administration. So basically, what a public administrator does in practice, or as an academic really, what we're interested in is literally the public's business. So we use perhaps fundamentally different processes than private administrators might use. But still, we sometimes have a difficult time drawing sharp distinction between sectors. So let's throw in some important characteristics of public administration that might be helpful. First of all, public administration is characterized by public authority, and that is the recognition that in fact government is not a business. Now that's a slogan that you've heard before, especially people running for office. They are running for city council, they're running for the governorship, they're running for Congress, and they say, I want government to run like a business. Now, in fact, government is not a business. Government does things that businesses don't do. Businesses do things that government doesn't do. I take their point. The point is a valid one. What they're really saying is that governments, all governments, should promote the value of efficiency. That is, to get more outputs per dollar of inputs. And so that's hard to disagree with, that we should promote efficiency. However, if we want to say that, we should strictly run like a business, which is to say some kind of executive director should characterize the presidency or the governorship or mayor's offices, then really constitutionally we are opposed to that because we have a separation of power system. And the second thing is we have public authority, that is by law authority to carry out the public's business. So that leads to this issue of public legitimacy, and this is difficult because whether so-called bureaucrats are good at their jobs or not, there has to be a legitimacy attached to what they do, right? Well, where is this legitimacy found? And as it turns out, in a few weeks, we're going to talk about this issue of legitimacy. What legitimates public administration? But the point is that the public must find what we do to be legitimate. And that leads to this idea of public value, which Mark Moore started talking about in 1995, way back when. And what Mark Moore is talking about, and this can apply to nonprofits as well, that is that in the for-profit sector, value is found typically it's measured by shareholder value for a corporation, or it's measured by proprietor revenue and profit, the owner's profit for a non-public corporation. But in the public sector and the nonprofit sector, we deliver a value that is sometimes more difficult to measure because it's difficult to monetize. But we do have to be able to articulate what that public value is. And if you want to get more into that, Mark Moore's book of 1995 is a really good one to pick up. And then there's a public mission, right? So in spite of the fact that it seems that public agencies sometimes exist for their own purposes and to perpetuate their own existence, and that is a criticism of bureaucracies. Really and truly, there is a public mission. If there weren't a public mission to fulfill, then that government agency should not exist, right? And then finally, there's this idea of public service motivation, which we talk about a lot. And this gets trickier because we're talking about the people who work in public agencies, the people who work in nonprofits, and we are asserting that they have some kind of somewhat altruistic public service motivation. Well, it gets tricky because not everyone, on the face of it, not everyone who works in government or even in nonprofits has that motivation. They may have other motivations. And secondly, it seems to also assert that people that work in the for-profit sector don't have something akin to a public service motivation. And we know that's not true. We know there are very many civic-minded persons, individuals in business, and even corporations. So the idea of public service motivation is something that you will encounter again and again, and it's studied a lot, and it is interesting, but it is tricky to measure. So I thought one of the ways, in keeping with what Kettle's talking about in the first 3 chapters, what are some of the things that we can use to describe public administration versus other sectors? So what I did here is I said, let's assume there's 3 sectors in our economy, something called the for-profit, something called the nonprofit, and something called the public sector. And so how can we differentiate these sectors? And so as you can see, I have about 6 different criteria that I use to do that. So the establishing authority is one, and then I move into values, the values of efficiency, effectiveness, equity, economy, competency. So what is the establishing authority for a business, for a for-profit business? Well, it's really the opportunity to make a profit, right? If I want to start a bicycle shop, I might do it because I'm really interested in bicycles. In fact, I probably am, but I'm also doing it to make a profit. I'm not probably going to do it just to, give favors to my bicycle riding friends. If I want to do that, I can do it on my own time, but I want to make a profit with my business. So it's an opportunity. There's an opportunity there. There's a market niche that provides me the opportunity to make money. But okay, so how about nonprofits and public or government organizations? Really, the establishing authority for a nonprofit is that there is some unfulfilled need that this organization meets. This is problematic for a lot of nonprofits. There are a lot of visionary people who say, hey, I'd like to form a nonprofit to feed the hungry. Well, that's really a great motivation. However, in your city, there might already be one or more food banks that actually do an excellent job of doing that. So what is the niche that you're going to fill? In the government sector, why do we form government agencies? It's because we need a structure to implement the provision of giving public goods to people. So if we think of a park as a pure public good, and the city By matter of policy, the council says we're going to build 10 parks in our city. Well, certainly the members of city council and the mayor aren't going to go out every day and mow the grass um, and maintain the park. Now, they could ask for volunteers to do that, and probably some cities do that. But in most cases, they're going to form an organization to do that and call it something like the Parks Department. So that is the establishing authority. So let's move on to values. So what about efficiency? Right, this is the value that people who say government should run like a business, this is what they seem to be pointing to, right? So in a company, in a for-profit business, efficiency is necessary to make marginal revenue. That is, you want to make money on every dollar of cost, right? So that means that uh, you want to maximize the output for every input that you have to put into that. So for every dollar that you spend on production, on rent, on utilities, on payroll, on equipment, you want to maximize the dollar amount that you make on your product. And some of that, or all of it, really is market driven. But you want to strive to be as efficient as possible. This is why companies try to keep personnel staffing to the right number. You know, it's inefficient to have too many people. It's also inefficient to have too few people. So they have to be efficient about that. Okay, how about in a nonprofit? Well, efficiency probably is necessary to satisfy most donors. I mean, if you give a lot of money to a nonprofit, you don't expect them to simply be inefficient. Um, and in the public sector, efficiency is necessary. It's often necessary in the delivery services because taxpayers are funding the effort. Well, what about effectiveness? So people also often say efficient and effective. This is efficient and effective. They use them in the same breath as if they're the same thing. They're not. Efficiency has to do with simply producing uh, a higher number of outputs per dollar of input. Effectiveness means you're getting the mission done. You're getting it done in an excellent way. Okay, so do companies have to be effective in what they sell? No, not necessarily, but that will hurt their profit in the long run. So um, if they have ineffective sales staff, if they have ineffective production staff, if they have ineffective research and development, um, it's going to hurt the bottom line. But they don't necessarily have to be effective all the time in every area. Um, how about in a nonprofit? Well, again, continued ineffectiveness can lead to a loss of support, right? A loss of legitimacy and eventual demise of your nonprofit. Now, effectiveness in the public sector actually is very important. Um, Many organizations in government will tell you right off the top that it's more important to be to be effective than to be efficient. And the military is very famous for saying that it's more important to be combat effective than to be efficient. So what does that mean? If you've been in the military, you know that the point of the military is to have some effectiveness on the battlefield. That actually is inherently inefficient. But if they're getting the mission done, that's what they're striving for. Now, often critics of government will say, well, you're using that for an excuse to be inefficient. And I think that's a valid critique. How about the value of equity? Do businesses have to be equitable? Well, no, they don't. And in fact, many businesses find clever ways really of discriminating against people. Um, in times in the not so recent past, um, uh, many businesses have blatantly discriminated against minorities, against women. Um, Women still get paid less than men in overall for the same kind of work. Sometimes discrimination is unconscious. Um, but the question that all that begs is that good for the bottom line? So if a company um, knowingly discriminates and is knowingly inequitable, will that hurt their bottom line? That is what they will look at. Um, how about nonprofits? Nonprofits are highly interested in equity, especially in the delivery of services to their client population. It doesn't mean they always act equitably, but that is what they're interested in. In the public sector, we are legally bound to act equitably. Again, that hasn't always been the case. As a matter of fact, what were called Jim Crow laws in the South, which were codified laws to discriminate against African Americans, were a legal way to practice discrimination. However, we have actually moved past that, even though we still have a lot of issues in the United States in terms of race relations. We have made progress in that area. But the point is that for the most part, we are legally bound to provide equitable service. Now, how about economy? Again, economy is not the same as efficiency. Economy just means doing things in a rationally economic way. So, a company doesn't have to practice economy. They can spend lavishly. They can throw giant birthday bashes for the CEO and spend $40,000 to do that. Now, is that smart? Probably not. But they could probably justify it by saying, "Hey, we're making a lot of money, so this is one of the ways we reward the CEO." On the nonprofit side, it's valuable, but it's not necessary depending on the service or the clientele. And in the public sector, economy is valuable, but it might be sacrificed for other values such as equity. And then finally, competency. And here we're getting to the people that actually work in these sectors, right? And I think we should argue that competency is a requirement across the board. This is an argument that people get into about the nonprofit sector, as a matter of fact. Many people will claim that nonprofit managers should not make a lot of money. That if you're executive director of a large nonprofit, maybe we should only pay you, 50% of the median family income. But how are you going to recruit competent people to do that? So this really is very much a sliding scale and an issue of perception. But we can argue that competency enhances the performance of any of these kinds of organizations in any of these kinds of sectors. But there are differences in the sectors, and I hope this chart helps you think about some of those. But we know that there are issues with government, right? So each of us has a different view on the effectiveness of government. But I believe as public administrators, it's really important for us to understand at least the size and scope of government in the United States so that we can discuss this in an educated and articulate manner. So let's talk about some of this, and the next few slides we'll talk about some myths of government as Kettle talks about, I think in chapter 2, and try to dispel some of those myths and present some facts. First of all, just to say, just to complain about the government is really imprecise. And because in fact, there are many governments in the United States. So when someone complains about the government, well, they might be accurate in a broad sense, but in a precise sense, they're really not making much sense. The middle school model we all learned about when we were in 7th grade or 8th grade or whatever it was, is that we have this federalist system with a national, which we sometimes often call the federal government. It's really the national government, and state governments. Cities are not mentioned at all in the Constitution. We say national, state, and local, but local governments really aren't part of the Constitution. In a legal sense, most local governments are creatures of the state. And the simplistic model holds that each level of government has distinct authorities and responsibilities, but that's really imprecise too, because the authorities and responsibilities often meld together and bump into each other, often conflict. And there are many myths about government that we should dispel as a starting point. And the first myth is that government at the national level was completely laissez-faire until about the New Deal, when Franklin Roosevelt introduced all kinds of new government programs. Um, that's partially accurate, but it's not really completely accurate. A second myth is that the national government is the largest of all the governments. In some senses it is, but in many other ways it isn't. Um, the national government is big compared to the national governments of other nations. Again, not really the case, and I'll show you that in a second. And that local government equals small government, and that the national government is intrusive, too intrusive in areas such as education. So the first myth, that big government wasn't involved in business or the lives of ordinary people until about the New Deal, really is not completely accurate, because there are many antecedents to large government involvement starting in the 1800s and earlier, perhaps. Especially in light of the Civil War, the national government became more involved in promotion of businesses, um, in some industries, as well as provision of property to ordinary people. The Homestead Act of 1862, in the midst of the Civil War, um, provided 160 acres of land to any person who would settle on that land and start farming and building on it within 5 years. Um, the Homestead Act actually helped settle the West. Um, the U.S. Department of Agriculture was formed in 1862. The U.S. Department of Agriculture really was formed to promote individual farmers and their agribusiness, if you will. That was what the U.S. Department of Agriculture was formed for, to promote agriculture. The Land Grant Act of 1862 was related. That provided grants of land to states, for 30,000 acres for every congressional seat they had. So really, what the states did is they sold that land, or they kept it, and the sale of that land created what we call land grant universities. So in most states, if you see the word like Kansas State University or Oklahoma State University, that was a land grant college. In our state, in Nebraska, the University of Nebraska at Lincoln was the original land grant university in Nebraska. Morrill Hall on the UNO campus is named Morrill Hall because it's named after the Morrill Act. Land grant colleges established the Reserve Officer Training Corps, um, which trained military officers. And in an 1890 amendment, it funded colleges to educate blacks and Native Americans in colleges. So the land grant was a hugely important government involvement in the states and for individuals, ultimately. Same year, 1862, the Pacific Railway Act. If you live in Omaha, you know that the Union Pacific is a huge company. The Union Pacific would not have existed without the Pacific Railway Act. The Transcontinental Railroad was a public-private partnership in which the federal government basically guaranteed the bonds, basically guaranteed the debt of the Union Pacific Railroad, which was formed through that act, and the Central Pacific Railroad in California. It granted huge amounts of land, very large amounts of land, to the railroads, which they could sell later, and they did, or which they could use for mining rights. And as a matter of fact, much of the coal in Wyoming was, and still is in some cases, the property of the Union Pacific Railroad. In 1887, when the railroads actually got so big that farmers complained about their monopolistic practices, Congress formed the Interstate Commerce Act and the Interstate Commerce Commission to regulate railroads. And it was formed to limit monopolistic tendencies. The Civil Service Reform Act of 1883 established the first permanent civil service in the United States, with the idea that we should move away from the spoils system, where every president would appoint anybody and everybody to work in the federal government, to a system where we had a professional corps of civil servants. It started small and it got bigger, But that was what Wilson was writing in the wake of when he wrote in 1887. So what about the size of the U.S. government compared to other countries? This is government employment as a share of the workforce in all these countries. And you can see the United States is really about in the middle of all these countries. Um, so the United States really, compared to other nations, government employment is not the biggest employer uh, in the nation. It's big, but it's not the biggest employer. Now, this is not a myth. This does actually demonstrate that um, the growth, the I think the interconnection between the national government and state governments has grown since the New Deal. Really, it took off since uh, the mid 60s during the LBJ, the President Johnson administration, when Medicare and Medicaid were introduced. And that is in the 1960s, health programs became pretty dominant in the money that the federal government was providing to states in forms of grants. So what you see here is, and this does actually sort of support the idea that the New Deal and the Great Society programs of Johnson really did increase the amount of government spending, and they did, because you can see that the amount of money that the federal government gives to states has greatly increased, and states really are very dependent in a lot of ways on the federal government now, especially in terms of Medicaid. Well, how about the size of the federal workforce? What this shows is the number of civilian employees per million Americans. And so actually, the federal workforce has actually declined. It was quite large in the years after World War II, into the 50s, into the 70s, and actually did then begin to decline. It declined a lot in the 90s. Uh, that was due to the fact that after the Soviet Union fell apart, uh, defense was greatly pared back, and many civilian employees uh, lost their jobs. Well, they didn't really lose their jobs. Probably a lot retired, but the number of employees was greatly reduced. So that's, the fact is the federal government has not really grown in number of employees. And so here's why. If you want to talk about growth in number of employees, that growth has mostly been at the state and local level. That red line shows the state and local level, which has increased steadily since the 80s because states are doing more, frankly. The federal government has stayed relatively static in terms of the government workforce. This is one of the reasons state and local employees outnumber federal employees, because there are many governments in the United States. I want you to look at that third line down. There are around 89,000 local governments. There's about 89,000 total governments in the United States. Many people don't even realize that. They think there's, 50 plus one plus all the cities, but this takes into account many kinds of governments. So at the bottom part of this chart, you see county governments, municipal governments, townships, school districts, and special districts, which can be things like in Nebraska, water districts, natural resource districts, conservation districts. These are all technically governments. That is, they have some elected board, and they have the authority to levy property taxes or other taxes, but mostly property taxes. So there are a great number of so-called governments in the United States. So this is what the various levels of government spend their money on. Kettle refers to this, and this is really important because there is this rumor that the federal government is too involved in things like education. Well, I think you can make that argument, but I'm not sure you can make it just based on the dollars spent. Every single state spends a large chunk of their budget every year on K-12 education. The amount of that money that comes from the federal government is really fairly insignificant compared to what the state itself is spending in its general budget. Um, and the state also spends a lot on higher education. Now, this chart says local governments spend a lot on elementary education, and they do too. So we have different funding structures in every state. In some states, the contribution from the state level is greater than from the local level, and in some states, the contribution from the local level is greater. But the point is that K-12 education and higher education are really among the largest consumers of tax dollars at state and local levels. And then we work our way down to things like highways and corrections, to police departments and fire departments. At the federal level, by far, the largest expenditure of discretionary funding is on defense. Now, on non-discretionary spending, that is so-called entitlement spending, Social Security is very large. Medicare and Medicaid are very large. So if you took healthcare spending at the federal level, defense spending, and Social Security spending at the federal level, that's about 78% of the expenditure of the federal government every single year. So when people start talking about lowering the cost of the federal government, unless you address defense, Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, you will not be able to make significant decreases in the amount that the federal government spends in its budget every year. You're going to see this chart later. I'm going to talk about this in a few weeks, but what I want you to look at here, just the big takeaway from this is that many people say, well, we don't need federal bureaucrats delivering things to us. We need to get items from the private sector. In fact, a lot of government spending is through the private sector. One of the greatest examples is the student loan industry. Student loans guaranteed by the federal government, but really the money is lent from private commercial banks. Vouchers. People argue that persons should be given vouchers to send their children to private schools. Well, that's still government spending. So a lot of government spending isn't handled through a bureaucrat, but it is still government spending nonetheless. We'll talk about this in a few weeks. So right at this time, I'm 30 minutes into this presentation. So we probably have another few minutes to go. So if you want to take a short break right now, put the video on pause, stretch out a little bit, please do so. Because what I want to dwell on at this point is, since I assigned you these readings by Goodnow and Wilson, because they are foundational, I really want to talk about public administration as a field of study and practice. So I'm really switching gears here from the role of government to public administration as our field, if you will. So it's really important that we read Goodnow and Wilson in context, right? Wilson is often looked to as the father of public administration. But what he was really talking about was this idea that the United States had grown from its constitutional era to an era where the machinery of government wasn't necessarily keeping up with the vision of the Constitution. Goodnow looked at administration as a separate branch of government and said as much, a fourth branch of government, if you will. And each of them promotes something called a politics-administration dichotomy. So this is a term that we use. What do we mean by the politics-administration dichotomy? And so Wilson said this. He said, administrative questions are not political questions. Although politics sets the task for administration, it should not be suffered to manipulate its offices. So as I alluded to earlier, Wilson wrote this piece in the light of the Civil Service Act of 1883, the Pendleton Act. So what he really meant to say was that there should be a professional corps of administrators who don't get involved in, who aren't sullied by electoral politics. So he looked at public service as kind of this set apart profession. And so therefore, people who work in public service should not be partisans. It should be business-like. Wilson said that the running of government should be like a business. Now, whether that's realistic or not, we can debate a lot, and we probably will. But the point is, Wilson said that yes, indeed, you can separate politics from administration. So politicians set policy, administrators carry them out in a neutral manner. That was sort of his dream state. So Goodnow also talked about the same thing. He said that a very large part of administration can be unconnected with politics. So what he meant by that was, what he really meant was that politicians shouldn't weigh in on established administrative procedures that are the result of previous laws. So if we had a law that established a pension bureau to pay pensions to veterans, to Civil War veterans, the politicians shouldn't be allowed to intervene in that, how that agency is run. Well, in fact, it happens that the politicians did intervene in that particular thing. And so his view was perhaps naive, but he was actually setting up kind of an ideal state. Well, what Goodnow, and when you read Goodnow, what you're going to notice, what he compares administration to is the judiciary, because he says, well, look, we have a separate judiciary. The judiciary is asked to be the arbiter of disputes between, not only between persons, but between persons who want to argue about the constitutionality of a law. And the judiciary was actually recognized as being impartial. So in Goodnow's mind, the administration department, he said the administration should be a separate branch, it should be impartial. And that means that administrators really have a different expertise than judges, but like judges, they have a separate expertise. So now, kind of going back a little bit, Wilson and Goodnow were writing in the late 1800s. And this is important because you can argue that the founders of the Constitution didn't envision perhaps the country growing as large as it did, or perhaps didn't envision that the government would grow as large as it did. They expected that the organizations that had to be set up to administer the Constitution would be relatively small. And so therefore, who ran government agencies up into the 1820s? And this author Rosenblum argues that it was elites. So, administrative selection was probably based on social class standing, kinship, rather than technical ability. So federal employment was kind of considered private property, with positions bequeathed to heirs, for example. And this was largely uncontested until Andrew Jackson was elected president. And Andrew Jackson basically said, this isn't right. I don't want a bunch of elites running government. I want people that support me running government. And so Andrew Jackson famously said, to the victor go the spoils. And not just Andrew Jackson, but all presidents following him up until around the 1880s spent a great deal of their time filling offices at the federal level and actually becoming involved in this personally. There's a great book by Holzer called Lincoln, President-Elect, and he details that Lincoln spent months, really, because he was elected in November, wasn't going to be inaugurated until March of 1861. He spent a great deal of his time working in his office, which happened to be in the Illinois state capitol, filling offices. I mean, every single day for hours on end, people would show up and say, I'd really like to be the Postmaster General of Springfield, Illinois. I'd really like to be the tariff officer at the Port of New York. And this was how jobs in the federal government were filled. That is, all these jobs turned over every 4 years when a new president was elected. Um, so there was this kind of symbiotic relationship between parties and appointed office holders. But the spoils system also led to another phenomena, which took root in cities and then persisted a lot longer, and that was so-called machine politics. And what that meant was, if you vote for me as mayor or as dog catcher or as garbage commissioner, I will perhaps give you or your family jobs. I will do you favors. So this kind of spoils system persisted in different forms into the 1900s. At the federal level, the Pendleton Act of 1883 was an effort to really do away with the spoils system. Eventually, government hiring has become somewhat regulated. Now, regulated is not the right word, but normalized in the sense that it's the expectation that some kind of expertise and testing is required to get a job in the government, not just a relationship with some elected official. And so civil service reform was really the product of the Pendleton Act that created the Civil Service Commission in 1883. So it really did seek to influence or staunch the influence of these people called spoilsmen. It's also during this time, the 1880s to the 1920s, that we start to recognize government employment as being actually a professional endeavor. So we see the first pensions for government workers. We see the first federal civil service pension act in 1920. This was actually predated by a military pension, which I'll get to in a second. But we also see the first pensions for teachers, for example, at the state level. So we're starting to see in this period kind of the professionalization of government work. So it's not that you're an elite, it's not that you're a supporter of the current administration or the current mayor or the current governor, it's that you're a professional government employee. And so also during this time, we're also starting to see that government organizations are being looked at as models of efficiency. And so we start to see the idea that the best kind of organization is this vertically pyramid-shaped bureaucracy, vertically integrated. And so we see the application of scientific management under Taylor. We see the normalization of budget processes start to take root. Still, a lot of this was really uneven, but this is where we start to see the professionalization of civil service. And then what most people like to go back to as being the beginning of big government is really this extension of the presidency. And this was not done over the objections of Congress. This was done with the support of Congress. So it's really true that the FDR administration was greatly expanded with the establishment of the executive office of the president, leading to the creation of agencies that we still see today, like the Office of Personnel Management and the Office of Management and Budget, which do work for the president. The executive office of the president is quite extensive now, and has a great deal of responsibility. And so it is during this time that we do see a growth of the presidency and a growth of the influence of the presidency vis-a-vis the Congress, right? And World War II actually only served to enhance the growth of the presidency because, of course, the president is commander-in-chief of the military, and World War II was a massively expensive and extensive military effort. It's also during this time that we see the innovation of the Social Security system of 1935. And so this is a recognition that government has a role in what had been something of the private lives of people. That is, what do you do once you retire? Even though states had established some pensions, for the most part, there were very few federal pensions. Social Security it didn't start out this way, but became basically a pension for every single U.S. citizen. Um, Now we can argue about Social Security all day long, but the point is that it became something of an expectation. And so then we enter this era of what some of the authors call heterodoxy. Um, Stillman in 2010 notes this. So we actually start to see after World War II a demise of the politics administrative dichotomy, a recognition that it's kind of hard to separate them. We start to see more administrative involvement in policy creation. Uh, we start to see growth of effectiveness as a normative value. And we start to see further professionalism in the civil service, specifically with the innovation of the senior executive service in 1978. But again, we do see a growth of presidential domination of administration and a continuation of the welfare state along with the growth in defense. Well, at some point in the 1980s and 1990s, and it kind of started in the United States with President Reagan saying that government is not here to solve your problems, government is your problem. We see more of an emphasis on privatizing some of the things that government does, outsourcing some of the things government does, um, more of an emphasis on business-like practices in government. The very famous book of the 1990s was written by Osborne and Gabler called Reinventing Government. And if you haven't read Reinventing Government, it's something you should read because that drove a lot of the thinking of the 90s, including the thinking of the Clinton administration in its so-called National Performance Review, which we'll get to later on in the course. So looping back to Wilson and Goodnow, um, what are Wilson and Goodnow talking about? What they're talking about is establishing a government or a politics and administration dichotomy. So the question is, does that really exist? And we're going to continue to talk about this. But in order to figure out whether there can be a dichotomy between politics and administration, first thing we have to do is define politics. So if you sat down with a piece of paper and you wrote the word politics in the left-hand column and the word administration in the right-hand column, and just came up with as many definitions as you could, I think what you would see is that some of the definitions we have for those words conflict internally. Politics is more than one thing, and administration is more than one thing. So what were Wilson and Goodnow really opposing and what were they advocating? And I would argue that what they were really talking about is they felt it was possible for administrators to avoid being contaminated, if you will, by electoral politics. And to a certain extent, we still hold that thinking in our culture. We still have laws against administrators being openly partisan, being parts of campaigns, especially at city levels and state levels and the national level. You know, it's not a civil servant working for the federal government is disallowed from being involved in partisan campaigns. Doesn't mean they don't vote. It just means that they're not allowed to be openly partisan. So that part of the politics administration dichotomy, we still honor, as a matter of fact. There are other parts, though, that start to be a little more problematic. If we think of politics as policy making, then we see that civil servants are involved. Often it is the expertise of civil servants that is called upon in creating law and policy. So in that sense, is it possible to separate politics and administration? So these are kinds of questions we should keep thinking about and keep debating. So for this week, after this lecture, which has been about 50 minutes, I think, um, I do want you to read the Wilson and Goodnow works, and this week and next week also, as a matter of fact. And we have a discussion question, as you can see, kind of the last bullet there, where I'm asking you to mix the theoretical with the practical, that is, combine Wilson and Goodnow this week. And next week, I'm going to ask you a little bit more about Wilson and Goodnow as well. but with the chapter 3 cases from the kettle text. So take a look at that discussion question, and I hope that you should be able to relate to what I'm doing there with the discussion. The second thing I want you to do is start thinking already about your scholarly book review project. The proposal is due February 10th. So please email me in advance if you have questions on that project. So what I'm really trying to say is you don't have to email me in advance with questions, but it might be helpful if you have questions before you submit the proposal on February 10th. So here's my references. By the way, in all my lectures, I do provide references, um, and you should get in the habit of doing the same. So that's it for this week. Thanks for listening to the lecture, and I look forward to your discussion. Thank you.